Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for an enthralling mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. This exclusive tale, narrated by Dr. Rami for the Curious Case channel, unravels secrets long buried beneath deception and greed. Don't forget to subscribe. The Vanished Testament, a case shrouded in intrigue and betrayal, first emerged in the early 1920s, a time when societal norms were shifting, and independent women like Eleanor Graves were beginning to challenge expectations. Educated, tenacious, and unyielding in her pursuit of truth, Eleanor defied convention to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Agatha Christie was a master of weaving societal critique into her mysteries, and this story is no exception. Through Eleanor's unwavering resolve and the legendary Hercule Poirot's sharp intellect, Christie subtly dismantles the rigid structures of power and control, highlighting intelligence as the ultimate weapon in the battle for justice. The case arrived at Poirot's doorstep with an urgency unlike any before. Eleanor Graves was no ordinary client. Her presence exuded an unshaken confidence, yet there was something beneath her composed exterior, a glimmer of desperation. Dressed in an elegant yet unpretentious manner, she wasted no time in pleasantries. "Monsieur Poirot, I need your help," she stated, her voice measured but firm. "My uncle's last will, the one that would have changed everything, has vanished, and I intend to find it." Poirot, ever the observer of human nature, studied her intently. "Mademoiselle," he murmured, "a missing will is but the surface of a deeper puzzle. The real question is who benefits from its absence." Hastings, seated beside Poirot, watched with curiosity as Eleanor's fingers tightened around the clasp of her handbag. She had come prepared for battle, but did she know just how deep this mystery ran? The web of deceit extended beyond family rivalries, entangling old grudges, hidden secrets, and an adversary who would stop at nothing to ensure the truth remained buried forever. What had truly happened on the night the testament disappeared? Who stood to gain from its erasure? As Poirot's little grey cells set to work, one thing became certain: this was no mere case of a lost document. It was a conspiracy, one that threatened not just Eleanor's inheritance, but her very life. "I suppose the best place to start is the beginning," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something unsaid. "I am an orphan, Monsieur Poirot. My past is tangled in shadows, and now so is my future." She exhaled, gathering herself before continuing. "My father, Henry Graves, and his elder brother Charles were the sons of a struggling innkeeper in Yorkshire. Life was harsh, and Charles, the ambitious one, left for America when he was barely 20. He built his fortune from nothing, trading in land and railroads, and became a man of immense wealth and power. My father, on the other hand, was drawn to books rather than business. He educated himself in whatever way he could, and secured a modest position as an accounts clerk. Against all odds, he married my mother, a woman of intellect and quiet grace, the daughter of a once renowned historian, whose fortunes had long since faded. But happiness was fleeting. My father died under unexplained circumstances when I was just 7 years old. My mother followed soon after, leaving me with nothing but unanswered questions and a distant uncle whose wealth could have changed everything. And now the only proof that my father was ever meant to inherit anything at all, the last will of Charles Graves, has disappeared, vanished, as if it never existed." She paused, her fingers trembling slightly as they clasped the edge of the chair. "I have reason to believe," she added, lowering her voice, "that someone ensured it was never found." Poirot leaned forward, his keen eyes never leaving her face. "Mademoiselle, a missing will is rarely a simple matter of misplaced papers. Tell me, who stands to gain from its absence?" By the time I was 14, I had already known more loss than most experience in a lifetime. My mother, the last tether to my childhood, passed away, leaving me utterly alone in the world. I had no siblings, no close relatives, no one except for my Uncle Richard, a man I had never met, but whose name carried a weight of wealth and whispers. He had returned from South Africa just months prior, having amassed a fortune in the diamond trade. Out of duty, or perhaps something deeper, he took me in. His estate, Blackwood Hollow, was a place of contradictions, grand yet eerily silent, its long corridors and candle-lit rooms shrouded in a past no one wished to speak of. Despite his reserved nature, Uncle Richard treated me well, providing for my education and raising me as if I were his own child. But even as he nurtured me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself held secrets, shadows that crept beneath the heavy oak doors, hushed conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. Uncle Richard had an unusual fascination with ancient documents and lost inheritances. He spent long hours locked away in his study, surrounded by parchment and ledgers, muttering about lineage and rightful claims. It wasn't until much later that I realized he had been drafting and redrafting his will, altering the names, shifting the fortunes, ensuring that only those he deemed worthy would inherit his wealth. Then, one night, everything changed. A terrible storm raged through the estate, and by morning, Uncle Richard was dead. The official story was a sudden illness, but I knew better. His will, the one I had seen with my own eyes just days before, had vanished, and in its place, a new document emerged, one that erased me from his legacy entirely. Someone had ensured I would be left with nothing. Someone had rewritten my fate, and I was determined to find out who. Despite Uncle Richard's kindness in taking me in, I quickly realized that his generosity came with rigid expectations. He was a man of formidable presence, a self-made figure who had little patience for what he called useless knowledge. Education, in his eyes, was a luxury reserved for men. Women, he believed, had no need for books or ideas beyond what was necessary to manage a household. He made his opinions clear from the very start. A woman's duty, he would say, is to keep a home running, not to fill her head with nonsense. He expected me to follow his beliefs without question, to learn the practicalities of estate management, the workings of the dairy, the ins and outs of household affairs. It was not cruelty, at least not in the way one might expect, but an unshakable conviction, rooted so deeply in his mind that no argument could sway him. But I had no desire to become the silent, dutiful ward he imagined me to be. I had always known my mind to be sharper than most, my curiosity a force I could not suppress. Books were my escape, my lifeline, my rebellion, and so I fought back, at first with quiet defiance, then with open resistance. I refused to abandon my studies, sneaking books into my room, reading by candlelight long after the house had fallen into silence. Uncle Richard disapproved, his displeasure evident in every glance, every clipped word. But there was something else beneath his stern exterior, an unspoken unease, as if my thirst for knowledge, my refusal to be molded, unsettled him. And then, one evening, I overheard something that changed everything. A conversation, muffled through the thick study door, my name, spoken in hushed tones, a will, a decision to ensure that my disobedience would cost me dearly. And at that moment, I understood, my fight was no longer just against outdated ideas. It was against something far darker. Someone was determined to silence me, to erase my claim, before I even had the chance to make it, and I would not let them win. My uncle and I clashed more times than I could count. Though bound by affection, we were both unyielding, our arguments fierce and unrelenting. He saw my ambitions as defiance, my thirst for knowledge as a rebellion against the life he had envisioned for me, and in many ways, he was right. I was rebelling. I refused to be confined within the narrow expectations he had set. He wanted me to accept my place, to follow the path of quiet obedience, but I was determined to forge my own destiny. Despite his opposition, I fought for my education, grasping at every opportunity fate allowed me. Winning a scholarship was my first victory, a triumph that gave me the leverage I needed. But the true battle came when I declared my intention to attend university. I had set my sights on Ravensbourne College, an institution known for nurturing minds like mine, women who refused to be mere footnotes in history. My uncle was livid. "You will throw away everything for foolish ideals," he thundered, his voice echoing through the halls of Blackwood Hollow. "A woman has no need for grand ideas. Her duty is to her home, her family, not to dusty books and empty dreams." But I had long stopped listening to words meant to break. I had a small inheritance from my mother, just enough to free me from his grasp, to carve a future on my own terms. I would not waste the gifts I had been given, not for tradition, not for fear. Yet, deep within me, A lingering unease remained. My uncle's anger was never just words. It carried weight, the kind that could shift destinies, erase possibilities. And then, the night before my departure, something happened that changed everything. A letter I had left in my study, detailing my scholarship and travel arrangements, vanished. The next morning, an urgent message arrived, one that sent a chill down my spine. The benefactor, who had secured my scholarship, had mysteriously rescinded their offer, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that my uncle's influence reached far beyond the walls of his estate. He was determined to keep me here, and I was just as determined to escape. Our final argument was the most bitter of all. My uncle laid out his terms with brutal clarity. He had no other heirs, and had long intended for me to inherit everything. His fortune, his estate, his legacy, it could all be mine, if only I abandoned what he called my foolish ambitions. But if I persisted in my defiance, if I chose my path over his wishes, I would be cut off entirely. No inheritance, no safety net, no second chances. I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I love you dearly, uncle," I told him, my voice calm but firm. "But I cannot be what you want me to be. I must live my own life." His expression darkened. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and edged with something unreadable. "You fancy your books make you wiser than me. But mark my words, girl, I'll pit my wits against yours any day. We'll see in the end who truly wins." That was 9 years ago. I left Blackwood Hollow that very night, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the weight of a broken bond. I had made my choice, and I never looked back, or so I thought. Last week I received a letter. It was brief, just a few hurriedly scrawled lines from my uncle's lawyer. My uncle was dead, and yet something in the wording unsettled me. The will had been changed, recently unexpectedly. Everything he once promised me had vanished, replaced by terms that made no sense. I was certain that something was wrong, that something had happened in the final days of his life, that no one wanted me to uncover. And so, after nearly a decade, I returned to Blackwood Hollow. But I was not the same girl who had left. I had spent years sharpening my mind, learning to read between the lines, to uncover the secrets people wished to keep buried. My uncle had once promised we would see what we shall see. Now it was my turn. Over the years, my visits to Blackwood Hollow became less frequent, but they remained cordial. My uncle and I never spoke of my education or the life I had built for myself, as if by unspoken agreement. His beliefs never wavered, and I never sought his approval. But as time passed, I heard whispers of his declining health, and then a month ago he died. I expected nothing from his will. After all, he had made it clear years ago that I had forsaken my inheritance. But when I received a summons from his solicitor, my curiosity overpowered my indifference. The terms of the will were unsettling. Blackwood Hollow, along with everything inside it, was mine, but only for a year. His words, written in ink as sharp as a dagger, sent a chill through me. Let my clever niece prove her wits. At the end of the year, should her mind fail to best my own, my estate and entire fortune shall pass elsewhere, to charities, to institutions, to strangers, but not to me, his only living blood relative. It was a challenge, a final game. Even from beyond the grave, my uncle had not conceded defeat. He had left behind a puzzle, a battle of wits designed to test me one last time. I could have walked away. I had built a life beyond the confines of this place, but something gnawed at me, a quiet whisper beneath my thoughts. My uncle had always prided himself on control, on calculation. He would never have left something so crucial to mere chance, which meant that somewhere within the walls of Blackwood Hollow, a truth lay hidden, one that he had not intended for the world to see. And if I wanted what was rightfully mine, I would have to find it before time ran out. I do not see it as a misfortune. My uncle made his terms clear, and I made my choice long ago. He was under no obligation to leave me his fortune, just as I was under no obligation to live by his rules. He issued a challenge from beyond the grave, a final test of wits, a game he believed he would still win. But what unnerves me is not the will itself, nor even the audacity of his conditions. It is the manner in which it was prepared. No lawyer drafted it, No legal minds ensured its legitimacy. It was scrawled on a pre-printed form, hastily filled, and signed by 2 servants, the only other residents of Blackwood Hollow, a man and his wife, loyal to my uncle, but with no ties to me. The ink on the paper is absolute, yet something about it feels wrong, as if it was written not with confidence, but with haste, as if my uncle, a man who meticulously planned everything, had been forced to act quickly. Could it be contested? Certainly. A will written in such a manner could be questioned, overturned, cast into legal dispute, but I have no desire to fight it in court. That is not the game my uncle intended, nor the one I intend to play. This is not about money. It never was. This is a battle of intellect, of strategy. My uncle thought himself the master of the game, the one who always held the final but he underestimated me once before. He thought I would falter, that I would follow the path he laid before me. He was wrong then. Perhaps he is wrong now. There is something in that house, something hidden, something he believed I would never uncover, and I intend to prove him wrong. It certainly suggests that possibility, said Pierce thoughtfully, his keen eyes narrowing. Somewhere within the walls of Blackwood Hollow, your uncle has hidden either a fortune, perhaps in notes or gold, or something even more valuable, a secret, a second will maybe, and he has granted you exactly 1 year to outmatch his cunning, and uncover it. Precisely, Mr. Pierce, and I am paying you the highest compliment by assuming that your ingenuity will surpass even mine. A slow smile played across his lips. Ah, that is most charming of you. My little grey cells are at your full disposal. But tell me, have you begun your search? Only a preliminary one, I admitted, but I know my uncle too well. If he meant to test me, he would not have made the path an easy one. He was a master of deception, a man who thrived on layers of misdirection. If he left something behind, he ensured it would not be found by mere chance. Pierce nodded, tapping his fingers against his desk. And you have a copy of the will. I reached into my bag, and carefully unfolded the document, placing it before him. The old parchment felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just words, perhaps a final message, hidden in plain sight. Pierce studied it, his expression unreadable, then almost imperceptibly, his demeanor changed. A flicker of something, a realization perhaps, flashed in his eyes. This, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, is not just a will. A chill ran down my spine. I leaned forward. Then what is it? He lifted his gaze, his smile now one of dark amusement. It's a challenge, he said, and your uncle has just made his first move. Miss Vale slid the yellow document across the table. Pierce unfolded it with measured precision, his eyes scanning the lines swiftly. He muttered under his breath, then his gaze sharpened. 3 years old, dated March 25th. At exactly 11 a.m., he tapped the paper, his voice calm but laced with intrigue. That's highly specific. A later will, even by half an hour, would render this one meaningless. My breath caught. So you think, it means your uncle wanted precision. It means there's something else, Pierce interrupted, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. A second will, or something that negates this one, and he expected you to find it, Miss Vale. The room felt smaller, charged with unseen tension. I leaned forward. You think he left a trail? A slow smile curled Pierce's lips. Oh, I think your uncle played a very deliberate game, and I, for one, love a challenge. He rose, turning to his companion. Elias, we leave for Blackwood Hollow tonight. The manor, Elias frowned. You think the answer is there? Where else? Pierce exhaled, glancing at me. The house holds its secrets still, and the couple who attended to your uncle, they are still there. Yes, I nodded. Yes, but, good, he said simply. Then it begins. A shiver ran down my spine. Whatever my uncle had hidden, whatever test he had left behind, I had the sinking feeling it was only the start. The following morning, the true search began. Our arrival the night before had been met with quiet anticipation. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, the caretakers, had been expecting us. The telegram from Miss Vale had ensured that Mr. Baker, a wiry man with the leathery complexion of someone well worn by time, had greeted us with polite reservation, while his wife, a towering figure with a matronly warmth, bustled about making us comfortable. After an exhausting journey, capped with a supper of roast chicken, spiced apple pie, and a generous serving of Devonshire cream, we had retired for the night. Now, in the cool light of morning, we found ourselves in the late Mr. Vale's study, a room that still seemed to hum with the presence of its former occupant. The air smelled faintly of aged paper and polished oak. Dark panelled walls enclosed the space, giving it a feeling of containment, of secrecy. Against one wall stood a large roll-top desk, its compartments stuffed with meticulously arranged papers, the order so deliberate, it was almost unsettling. Pierce ran a finger along the edge of the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the room. This is where he spent his final years. Mrs. Baker, standing by the door, nodded solemnly. Hardly left this room, he didn't. Always scribbling in that ledger of his. Said he had unfinished business. Unfinished indeed, Pierce murmured. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Your uncle left us a puzzle, Miss Vale. The question is, how deep does it go? A chill passed over me. This was more than just an inheritance. It was a test, a challenge written in ink, and hidden behind the walls of Blackwood Hollow. And something told me the answers would not come easily. The wall against which the desk stood seemed to loom over us, as if it, too, were guarding the secrets of the past. The heavy leather armchair, its arms worn smooth from years of use, suggested that this very spot had been the old man's fortress, his throne. Across the room, a large chintz-covered settee stretched along the opposite wall, its floral pattern faded with age, blending seamlessly with the deep window seats covered in the same fabric. The windows, tall and narrow, allowed only a thin ghostly light to filter in, casting long spindly shadows across the wooden floor. Poirot, calm and methodical as always, lit one of his delicate cigarettes, watching the thin stream of smoke coil into the air before addressing us. We must first devise a plan of campaign. Strategy, mon ami, is key in any battle, especially one against the wits of a man who does not wish to be defeated, even in death. He gestured to the vast room with a wave of his hand. Already I have taken a preliminary tour of the house, and I am most inclined to believe that whatever we seek, whatever test your uncle devised, it is here within these very walls. The other rooms may hold distractions, red herrings even, but this, he tapped the desk lightly, this was his sanctuary. If there is a clue, it is here. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The very idea of my uncle orchestrating such an elaborate scheme, even in death, sent a shiver down my spine. Hastings, leaning against the mantel, frowned. You believe the will is hidden somewhere in this room? Poirot gave a slight shake of his head. Non, non, my friend. If it were as simple as that, we would already be triumphant. No, what we must look for is not the will itself, but something that points to its true location. An overlooked letter, a note, a numerical code scrawled in the margin of an old ledger, anything seemingly ordinary, yet placed with purpose. He exhaled slowly. To find such a thing we must approach the search with meticulous precision. His sharp eyes flicked toward me. Miss Vale, tell me, did your uncle have any particular habits when working? Any object he was especially attached to? I hesitated, searching my memory. He always kept his ledgers in order, with every paper carefully docketed. He despised clutter. My gaze drifted toward the desk, and he had a habit of tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair while deep in thought. He did it unconsciously. Ah, Poirot's mustache twitched in satisfaction. You see, already the mind begins to paint a picture. A man of order, yes, but also a man who delighted in control. If he left behind a trail, it will be subtle, buried within the structure of his daily routines. He turned sharply. But before we begin, we need more information. He gestured toward the small brass bell on the desk. Ring the bell, I pray you. Let us summon the good Mr. and Mrs. Baker. They may hold the missing thread we seek. I reached for the bell, the cold metal smooth beneath my fingertips. As its chime echoed through the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the precipice of something far greater than a simple inheritance, something hidden, something waiting to be found. I did as Poirot instructed, pressing the small brass bell that rested on the desk. The soft chime rang through the quiet house, its sound absorbed by the heavy wooden beams and aged wallpaper. As we waited, Poirot moved about the room, his sharp eyes scanning every detail, his hands tucked behind his back in that characteristic pose of deep contemplation. A man of method, this Mr. Marsh, he mused, stopping by the large roll-top desk. His fingers trailed lightly along the polished surface. See how neatly the packets of papers are docketed, every document labeled, categorized and stored with meticulous precision. His gaze flicked toward the cabinet against the far wall, and observed the china cabinet keys, each with their own ivory label, carefully inscribed. Even the china within is arranged with mathematical accuracy. Plates stacked in descending size, cups aligned as though in military formation. It rejoices the heart. Such order, such discipline. I found myself nodding. My uncle had always valued structure, an unwavering devotion to detail that extended to every aspect of his life. Everything in its place, not a single object positioned without thought. Poirot's admiration, however, was short-lived. He suddenly halted, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto something small yet distinctly out of place. There, dangling from the lock of the desk, was the key itself, but it was not the key that drew his attention. Attached to it, affixed with a piece of brittle yellowing string, was a small crumpled envelope. Unlike the other neatly labeled tags, this was different, old, dirty and marked with what appeared to be hurried handwriting. Poirot reached for it slowly, as though testing whether it was truly there or simply a trick of the light. Gently he withdrew it from the lock, his fingers brushing the rough paper with delicate precision. His frown deepened as he turned it over, studying the surface. "Curious," he murmured, almost to himself, "very curious indeed." Hastings, ever impatient, leaned forward. "What is it, Poirot?" Rather than answer immediately, Poirot placed the envelope flat upon the desk, smoothing out its creases with his fingertips. "You see, my friend, there is something quite unnatural about this." He tapped the envelope lightly. "Our late Mr. Marsh, so fastidious, so precise, would he have left something so carelessly attached to the very key of his desk? A desk which, as we must assume, holds documents of the utmost importance." I felt a chill pass over me. He was right. My uncle would never have tolerated such disorder, not unless there was a purpose to it. Poirot carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single folded sheet of paper. For a moment we all held our breath as he unfolded it. The ink was faded, the handwriting jagged, as though written in haste, or under duress, and then he read aloud, "To the one who dares look beyond the obvious, remember the greatest truths are often hidden in plain sight. Trust not what is seen, but what is overlooked." A heavy silence filled the room. The words felt like a whisper from beyond the grave, a message from my uncle himself, daring us to uncover what he had so carefully concealed. Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Ah," he murmured. "Now we begin." Poirot's keen eyes studied the envelope, his fingers tracing the rough edges as though attempting to decipher its secrets before even opening it. The paper was aged, its surface crinkled and brittle to the touch, and scrawled across the front were the words, "Key of roll-top desk." But something about the handwriting was off, harsh, jagged, utterly at odds with the pristine labels that adorned every other key in the house. It was an unsettling contrast, as if an entirely different hand, one unfamiliar with the meticulous order of this place, had written it. Poirot's frown deepened. "An alien note," he murmured, half to himself. "I could swear that here we no longer have the personality of Mr. Marsh. This is not his hand. His is the mind of precision, of symmetry, of meticulous detail. This," he tapped the envelope lightly, "this is something else. But whose?" I felt a shiver of unease. Surely no one else has had access to this room. Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Only Miss Marsh, I believe, and she, if I am not mistaken, is also a young lady of method and order." "No, mon ami, this is someone else entirely." As if on cue, the door creaked open, and Baker entered in response to the bell. He was an aging man, his face weathered from years of service, but his posture was upright, his demeanor one of quiet dignity. Poirot turned to him with his usual air of polite command. "Baker, would you be so kind as to fetch Madame your wife? I have a few questions for you both." The man hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, sir." He disappeared into the corridor, his footsteps echoing faintly on the wooden floorboards. Poirot remained by the desk, fingers drumming lightly on the polished surface, his mind clearly ticking through possibilities. The air in the room felt thick with expectation. The desk itself, so neatly arranged, now seemed less like a mere piece of furniture, and more like a vault, one that held secrets waiting to be unearthed. Moments later, Baker returned, his wife following close behind. Mrs. Baker was a woman of substantial proportions, her round face framed by wisps of graying hair. She wiped her hands hastily on her apron, her expression one of open curiosity, perhaps even excitement. Poirot, ever the gentleman, offered a gracious nod before speaking. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, I appreciate your time. As you are aware, Miss Marsh has entrusted me with investigating certain matters regarding her late uncle's estate. I trust I can count on your candor. The couple exchanged glances before Baker cleared his throat. Of course, sir, he said. We'll do whatever we can to help. Mrs. Baker nodded fervently. Aye, sir, we don't want to see Miss Violet done out of what's rightfully hers, not after how she took care of the old gentleman all those years. Wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't. Poirot's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. That is good to hear, he said smoothly. Now tell me, aside from Miss Marsh, has anyone else had access to this study since Mr. Marsh's passing? Baker shook his head almost immediately. No one, sir. Miss Marsh was very particular. She locked up the room herself after the lawyer came and read the will. Didn't want anyone disturbing his things. Poirot's fingers hovered over the strange envelope once more, and yet he murmured, someone somewhere has disturbed them. A silence settled over the room. Mrs. Baker wrung her hands in her apron. Sir, she said hesitantly, do you think someone might have been here without us knowing? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead he carefully lifted the envelope once more, as though weighing its very presence in his hands. Finally he said, that, madame, is precisely what I intend to find out. The mystery had deepened. Someone had been here, someone who did not belong, and they had left behind a clue, one that might lead us either to the truth, or into far greater danger. The air in the study felt thick, heavy with something unseen, secrets, perhaps, or the weight of an unfinished game left behind by a man who had known exactly how to play. Poirot, ever precise, adjusted his cuffs before continuing, his keen gaze flicking from Mr. Baker to his wife, his mind undoubtedly turning over every piece of information they had given him so far. The will, he said, his voice smooth but pointed. You say you both witnessed it being signed? Yes, sir, Baker answered promptly. I remember it clear as day. The old master called us in, had us sign our names, and that was that. Poirot's head tilted slightly, like a cat considering a puzzle. And this will, Baker, you mentioned something curious. You were sent to fetch 2 forms, not 1. Why 2? Baker shifted uncomfortably, rubbing at his chin. Well, sir, I reckon it was just for safety, you know, in case he made a mistake on the first one. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on the polished desk. And did he indeed make a mistake? Aye, sir, I remember it well. He signed one, but then he got to muttering, shaking his head, and before we knew it, he was filling out the second. Poirot's entire posture sharpened with interest. He discarded the first. Baker nodded. Yes, sir. Crumpled it up. He did. Tossed it aside like it was nothing. Then he had us sign the second one. Poirot exchanged a glance with me, and I knew at once that my own thoughts mirrored his. A second will. A discarded first. The implications were as vast as they were unsettling. And what time of day did this take place? Poirot asked, his tone casual, though I could see the razor's edge beneath it. Baker hesitated, but before he could fumble through an answer, his wife cut in, her memory sharper. It was just before 11, she said firmly. I know because I'd just put the milk on for the cocoa. I remember it plain as anything, 'cause it boiled over while we were in there, made a terrible mess. Poirot's lips twitched into something that was not quite a smile. Interesting, he murmured. And afterward, when did you return to the study? Oh, must have been an hour later, Mrs. Baker continued. We went back in after finishing up in the kitchen, but by then he'd already sealed the will away. Poirot leaned back ever so slightly, his fingers steepling as his mind worked through the implications. An hour. An entire hour. Plenty of time for a man like Mr. Marsh to do something clever, something deliberate, and yet something was still missing. I could see it in Poirot's eyes. The puzzle pieces were there, scattered across the board, but the final picture remained just out of reach. There was a will, yes, but where was the first one? The one he had discarded. Had it truly been destroyed, or had it been hidden? The game had just become far more interesting. Poirot tapped his fingers against the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the bakers as he weighed their words carefully. There was something here, an inconsistency, a shadow of doubt lurking just beneath the surface. "You say," he repeated slowly, "that your master tore up the first will, destroyed it completely." "Yes, sir," Baker answered, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Said he'd made a mistake and had to start fresh. He had us sign again, and then he sealed it up proper." Poirot studied him for a moment before holding out the key with the attached envelope, his fingers pinching it delicately. "And this handwriting, Baker, this inscription, key of roll-top desk, is it your master's?" There was a pause, not long but just long enough. Then Baker nodded, a little too quickly. "Yes, sir, that's his writing, no doubt about it." I caught Poirot's gaze, and I knew he had spotted the lie as well. Baker was covering something up, but what? And after this second signing, what did Mr. Marsh do? Poirot asked smoothly. "He went out to the village, sir," Baker replied, "paid some tradesmen's bills, as he always did at the end of the month." Poirot tilted his head, his mind already working through the implications. That did not seem particularly suspicious, unless of course there was more to the story than Baker was letting on. Poirot changed tactics. His voice remained casual, almost absent-minded. "Tell me, has anyone entered this house, this room since your master's passing? Any strangers, any visitors?" "No, sir," Baker said firmly. "No one but Miss Violet." Poirot nodded, but did not seem satisfied. His gaze flicked toward Mrs. Baker, who was fidgeting slightly with the edge of her apron. "You forget the workman, Jim," she said suddenly, her voice hesitant but insistent. Poirot's head snapped up, his entire body suddenly rigid with attention. "Workman," he repeated, his voice sharpening. "What workman, Mrs.?" Baker glanced at her husband, as though uncertain whether she should continue. Baker's face darkened slightly, but Poirot's eyes remained locked onto the woman, expectant, unwavering. "Well," she began, twisting her apron between her fingers, "it was a couple of years back, 2.5 maybe. The master had some repairs done in the house. Nothing big, you understand, just some work here and there. I thought it was a bit of nonsense myself. The place was perfectly fine, but he insisted." Poirot's expression did not change, but I could sense the shift in him, the way he latched onto this new thread. "Repairs," he murmured. "And what precisely did these repairs involve?" Mrs. Baker frowned slightly, trying to recall. "I couldn't say exactly, sir. He had the man working in here a good deal though. The master was very particular about it, didn't let no one else in while the work was being done." Poirot exchanged a glance with me. My own thoughts were racing alongside his. A workman, brought in for vague, unnecessary repairs, a room that Mr. Marsh had guarded closely, a will that had supposedly been destroyed, and a manservant who was lying about something. The pieces were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was still just out of reach. Poirot tapped the desk once more, his voice quiet but certain. "I believe," he said, "that our dear Mr. Marsh left behind more than just a mystery. He left a challenge, and I, mon ami, do not intend to lose." As the Bakers left the room, Poirot clasped his hands together, his eyes alight with the satisfaction of a hunter closing in on his prey. "Hastings, mon ami, we are now certain that a second will was made," he declared, "and we also know that Mr. Marsh took steps to ensure its hiding place was secure. But there is no need to tear apart this house blindly. No, no, why fumble in the dark when the answer lies waiting for us in Plymouth?" With renewed determination, we set out to locate the workman who had been summoned to Crabtree Manor. After some persistent inquiries, we traced the firm responsible for the renovations. Its employees had been with them for years, making it easy to identify the two men who had worked under Mr. Marsh's precise and secretive instructions. One of them, a tall, gaunt man named Cogan, with a grizzled mustache and a sharp memory, recalled the peculiar job vividly. "Yes, sir, I remember it well," he said, rubbing his stubbled chin. "Most ordinary repairs, they were, but there was one particular task the old gentleman was very particular about. We took up one of the bricks from his fireplace, right there in his study, carved out a small cavity beneath it. then fitted the brick back so neatly you'd never know it had been touched. You'd press the second brick from the end, and like magic, the hidden compartment would pop right open. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Très bien, Monsieur Cogan, you have been most helpful." Armed with this knowledge, we returned to Crabtree Manor, our spirits soaring. This was it, the final step. Poirot locked the study door behind us, ensuring we would not be disturbed. We knelt before the grand old fireplace, its surface worn smooth by time and history. The bricks revealed no indication of tampering, but Cogan's instructions were clear. Poirot reached forward, and with a careful, deliberate motion, pressed on the second brick from the end. There was a faint, almost imperceptible click. Slowly, like the opening of a well-kept secret, the hidden compartment revealed itself. Poirot's hand plunged into the cavity, his expression one of triumph, until in an instant it shifted. The satisfaction drained from his face, replaced by sheer, unmasked disbelief. His fingers tightened around something brittle. He withdrew his hand. A single charred fragment of stiff paper lay in his palm. For a moment, there was only silence, a terrible, crushing silence. Poirot stared at the blackened scrap, his normally keen face frozen in astonishment. "Nom de nom," he burst out, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Someone has been here before us." We scrambled closer, examining the pitiful remains of what had once been a crucial document. It was unmistakably a piece of the will. A fraction of Baker's signature was still visible, but nothing remained of the words that would have changed everything. The will had been burned, destroyed. Poirot sat back on his heels, his normally impeccable composure faltering. He who prided himself on his little grey cells had been outplayed. The truth had been within reach, only to be snatched away at the last possible moment. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Poirot, what do we do now?" For once the great detective did not have an immediate answer. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then slowly his gaze lifted, sharp as a dagger. "Now, Hastings," he murmured, "we hunt." Poirot's brow furrowed as he stared at the charred remains of the will, frustration darkening his features. "I do not understand it," he growled, his usually controlled voice laced with irritation. "Who destroyed this? And mon Dieu, what was their purpose?" I hesitated before offering a suggestion. "The Bakers, perhaps." Poirot shook his head sharply. "No, Hastings, neither will contain anything for them. In fact, they stand to gain more by staying under Miss Marsh's employment than if the estate were transferred to the hospital. Tell me, how does it benefit anyone to destroy the will?" He exhaled in exasperation. "The hospital, but one does not suspect institutions." I mulled it over. Perhaps the old man changed his mind, and burned it himself. Poirot glanced at me, his frustration easing just a little. "Ah, for once, Hastings, you say something sensible. It is a possibility." With that, he dusted off his knees and rose to his feet.
Yeah.
The air of disappointment around him was palpable. "Well, my friend, we can do no more here. We have unraveled the mystery, but alas, it does not bring the desired result. Miss Marsh is no better off than before." Resigned, we made our way back to the station, just managing to catch a train bound for London. Poirot, unusually quiet, seemed lost in thought. I, exhausted from the long day, slumped into my seat and dozed. Suddenly, just as we were rolling out of Taunton, Poirot let out a piercing cry. "Vite, Hastings, wake up, jump, jump, I say." Before I could even process what was happening, I found myself on the platform, hatless, our luggage disappearing into the night along with the train. Furious, I turned to Poirot. What in blazes? He was oblivious to my anger. His eyes were alight with a manic energy. "Imbecile that I am. No, 36 times an imbecile," he muttered, pacing in agitation. "I have overlooked the most obvious clue, the very thing that should have caught my attention from the start." I groaned. "For heaven's sake, Poirot, what now?" "The tradesmen's books, Hastings. We left them entirely out of account. What do they have to do with anything?" Poirot's face turned smug. "Never mind that now. We must return at once." Easier said than done. After much difficulty, we found a slow train to Exeter, and from there, Poirot hired a car. It was well past midnight by the time we arrived back at Crabtree Manor. The Bakers, groggy and bewildered, opened the door, gaping at us as if we were ghosts. Poirot did not spare them a glance. He marched straight to the study, his confidence radiating. "My friend," he said grandly, "behold." With dramatic precision, he unlocked a desk and retrieved a small envelope tied to the key. I blinked. "Poirot, you can't possibly believe a full will is inside that tiny thing." Ignoring me, he carefully sliced the envelope open and unfolded it. Then, to my astonishment, he lit the fire and held the inside surface of the paper to the flames. For a moment nothing happened. Then faint letters began to emerge. "Look, mon ami," he cried triumphantly. I leaned closer. There, written in delicate, ghostly script, were the unmistakable words, "I leave everything to my niece, Violet Marsh." The date was inscribed, March 25th, 12:30 p.m., and beneath it, two signatures, Albert Pike, confectioner, and Jessie Pike, married woman. I could barely breathe. "But, is it legal?" Poirot chuckled. "Ah, Hastings, you ask the wrong question. There is no law against writing a will in disappearing ink. The intent of the testator is clear, and the beneficiary is his only living relative." I shook my head in disbelief. "But why would he go to such lengths?" Poirot's smile was full of admiration. "Because he was clever, devilishly clever. He foresaw exactly how a searcher would think. He made two wills to throw suspicion off, but his real will, the genius of it. He scrawled on a worthless envelope, using an ink that would vanish with time. He got two unsuspecting witnesses to sign it under some pretense. Then he tied it to his desk key, knowing that anyone searching for the will would overlook it. He smirked. If his niece had the wit to solve his puzzle, then she had the intelligence to inherit his fortune. I let out a slow breath. "But, she didn't solve it, did she?" Poirot's expression turned smug. "Non, Hastings. But she proved her intelligence by placing her faith in me." He straightened his cuffs. "Always trust the expert, and now she shall have her rightful inheritance." I stared at him, still in awe of how the entire mystery had unraveled. I wonder what old Andrew Marsh would have thought. Poirot smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Oh, my dear Hastings, I think he would have been delighted." Poirot's brows knitted together in a deep frown as he examined the charred remains of the document. His frustration was palpable. "I do not understand," he murmured, his voice edged with restrained fury. "Who destroyed this? And for what purpose?" "The Bakers?" I suggested tentatively. Poirot shook his head, his sharp eyes glinting. "No, mon ami, neither will had anything for them. If anything, they would be safer under Miss Marsh than if this place went to a hospital. No, the destruction of this will benefit someone, but whom?" I hesitated. What if the old man changed his mind and burned it himself? Poirot rose gracefully to his feet, dusting his knees meticulously. "Ah, Hastings, for once a remark of intelligence. It is possible, yes, but not probable. There is something I am missing." A heavy silence hung between us, thick with unspoken possibilities. Poirot's frustration was mounting, but he hid it beneath the habitual fastidiousness with which he adjusted his cuffs. "We can do no more here," he finally admitted, exhaling sharply. "We have pitted our wits against the late Andrew Marsh, and yet we leave no closer to proving Miss Marsh's claim. We left the house just managing to catch the last train to London." Poirot was unusually quiet, his mind clearly still working at the puzzle. I, on the other hand, leaned back against the seat, exhausted. Just as we were pulling out of Taunton Station, Poirot suddenly let out a high-pitched, triumphant exclamation. "Vite, Hastings! Quick, jump, I say!" "What?" I barely had time to register what was happening before Poirot yanked me off the train. In the next instant, we were standing, disheveled and confused, on the platform, watching as our train disappeared into the darkness without us. Poirot spluttered. "What the devil?" But he was already pacing, his eyes ablaze with realization. "Mon Dieu, what a fool I have been. Triple fool. No, 36 times the imbecile," I groaned. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Poirot, what now?" He turned to me abruptly, his face alight with renewed urgency. "The tradesmen's books, Hastings. I left them out of my calculations entirely. What about them?" He waved a hand impatiently. "No time to explain. We must return to Crabtree Manor at once." Easier said than done. The trains had stopped for the night, and it took some frantic arrangements before Poirot managed to hire a car to drive us back to the estate. It was the dead of night when we arrived, and rousing the Bakers at such an ungodly hour was no easy task. Their bewilderment was evident, but Poirot barely spared them a glance. He stormed straight into the study, his eyes scanning the room with the keen scrutiny of a hawk. "I have been blind, Hastings, blind," he muttered. "But now behold." He marched to the desk, seized the key, and deftly detached the small inconspicuous envelope tied to it. I stared at him. "Poirot, what in the world?" With the utmost care, he sliced open the envelope, and laid it flat. Then, to my utter disbelief, he lit a match and held the inside surface of the envelope over the flame. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if summoned by magic, faint letters began to emerge from the paper. My breath caught in my throat. "Look, mon ami," Poirot cried in triumph, his eyes gleaming. I looked. There, in ghostly writing, were just a few lines. "I leave everything to my niece Violet Marsh." It was dated March 25th, 12:30 p.m., and bore the signatures of two witnesses, Albert Pike, confectioner, and Jessie Pike, his wife. "But is it legal?" I stammered. "As far as I know, there is no law against writing one's will in invisible ink," Poirot replied smoothly. "The intent of the testator is clear, and Miss Marsh is his only living relative. The old man outwitted us all, Hastings. He anticipated every move a searcher would make. That I, the great Hercule Poirot, fell for his ruse." He gestured animatedly. "Consider, he prepares two will forms, has the servants sign twice to create confusion, and then, in a stroke of genius, writes the real will in an ink designed to disappear. On some simple pretense, he obtains the signatures of a confectioner and his wife, people no one would think to suspect. Then, instead of hiding it in a complicated place, he leaves it in plain sight, tied to the key of his desk." Poirot let out a small admiring laugh. Oh, the cleverness of the old man! He wanted to test his niece. If she was truly worthy of the inheritance, she would see through his trick. If not, well then perhaps she did not deserve it after all. I shook my head slowly. "But she didn't see through it, did she?" Poirot wagged a finger at me. "Ah, but you are wrong, my friend. She proved her intelligence in another way, by seeking out Hercule Poirot. Always employ the expert, n'est-ce pas?" I exhaled deeply, still processing everything. I wonder what old Andrew Marsh would have thought of all this. Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I think, Hastings, he would have been very, very pleased." This story narrated by Dr. Rami. Don't forget to subscribe to the Curious Case channel, and be sure to leave a comment.